Before Disney softened them, before the brothers Grimm cleaned them up, before they became bedtime stories, these tales were warnings. Not metaphors, not moral fables, warnings about real people, real crimes, and real monsters who actually walked the earth. And the horror isn't that someone invented these stories. The horror is that they didn't have to. Let's start with Bluebeard, the man with the locked room, the dead wives, the key stained with blood that no amount of washing could clean. Most people assume he's purely fictional. He isn't. The leading candidate for the real Bluebeard is Gilles de Rais, a 15th century French nobleman who fought alongside Joan of Arc. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, a decorated war hero, a marshal of France. He was also, by his own confession, a serial killer of children. Hundreds of them, carried out in his castle while his servants kept the household running as if nothing was happening. What makes de Rais so disturbing isn't just the scale. Historians estimate somewhere between 80 and 200 victims, mostly peasant boys lured to his estate. It's the normalcy of the world around him. Nobles visited, guests dined, the church received his donations. And below the surface, in the lower chambers, something unspeakable was happening. When he was finally arrested in 1440, his own confession broke the court. Judges reportedly wept. They ordered his words stricken from the record because they were too graphic to preserve. He was hanged and burned. His ashes were collected by noblewomen who considered him a martyr. The locked room in Bluebeard isn't a metaphor for forbidden curiosity. It's a memory of a real door in a real castle behind which the unthinkable had been happening for years while everyone around it looked away. The second candidate, and some scholars find him more convincing, is Connemore the Cursed, a 6th century Breton chieftain who reportedly murdered multiple wives after a prophecy told him one of his children would kill him. He didn't wait for the child to be born. He killed the women before they could give birth. His last wife, Tryphene, was reportedly beheaded and later canonized as a saint. That's the actual origin story, a man so terrified of a prophecy that he murdered pregnant women to prevent it. And someone turned that into a fairy tale about a curious wife who shouldn't have opened a door.
Sleeping Beauty is older and stranger than most people realize, and its oldest versions contain something the Disney adaptation wisely chose to leave out entirely. The earliest known version of the story, not Perrault, not the Brothers Grimm, but a 14th century Italian tale called Sun, Moon, and Talia, doesn't end with a kiss. In that version, the sleeping woman is not awakened. She's assaulted in her sleep by a king who finds her in the forest. She gives birth to twins while still unconscious. One of the infants accidentally sucks the flax splinter from her finger, which wakes her. That's the original. The prince isn't a rescuer. He's the danger. But who was the historical figure? The connection that historians have traced most carefully leads to a real disease, encephalitis lethargica, a sleeping sickness that swept through Europe in waves between the 14th and 17th centuries, exactly the period when Sleeping Beauty stories began appearing. Victims would fall into catatonic states, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. They were conscious but unable to move, unable to speak, staring at ceilings while their families grieved and priests administered last rites to people who were still technically alive. There are documented cases of people waking up in their own coffins. But there's a more specific historical route that connects to the sexual violence embedded in the story's origins. The court of Louis XIV, where Perrault was writing, was full of it. Child marriage was legal and practiced among the nobility. Girls as young as 12 were given to men 4 times their age. The sleeping woman in these stories was often a stand-in for young noblewomen who had no agency in what happened to their bodies. Women who were expected to be passive, beautiful, and available. The curse is the world they were born into. The sleep is compliance enforced from childhood. What the story frames as a fairy tale, the women living it called Tuesday. Snow White brings us to one of the most meticulously researched historical connections in the genre. In 2012, a German historian named Eckhard Sander published work tracing Snow White to a real woman named Maria Sophia von Erthal, born in 1729 in Lohr am Main, Bavaria, which happens to be right in the territory where the Brothers Grimm collected their stories. Her father remarried after her mother's death, and her stepmother, Claudia Elizabeth von Venningen, was famously cruel and favored her own biological children over Maria Sophia. The family owned a mirror, not a magic mirror, but a talking mirror, a type of mirror manufactured in lore that used a special acoustically resonant backing, known locally as a speaking mirror, because it echoed voices with unusual clarity. Fairest of them all takes on a different dimension when the mirror could literally speak. The dwarves? The mines near Lore employed child laborers, stunted from malnutrition and years underground, often wearing the exact kind of clothing depicted in early illustrations. The glass coffin? The region was famous for its glasswork. The poisoned apple? Apples laced with belladonna or arsenic were a known method of poisoning in early modern Germany. The glass coffin is in a museum in Lore to this day. You can see it. You can stand in front of it and understand that somewhere behind this story is a real woman, a real stepmother, and a real hatred that someone felt compelled to write down and preserve forever.
Little Red Riding Hood is the one that feels most like a pure metaphor, and it is, partly, but the historical roots run dark in a different direction. In medieval and early modern Europe, wolf attacks were not fairy tale events, they were documented disasters. In the winter of 1450, a pack of wolves entered Paris through gaps in the city walls damaged during the 100 Years' War and killed 40 people in the streets. In 16th century France, a rash of attacks attributed to wolves turned out, upon investigation, to be something worse. The Beast of Gévaudan, which postdates Perrault's version but reflects the same fear, killed over 100 people in southern France between 1764 and 1767. Mostly women, mostly children, mostly people traveling alone through forests. The king sent soldiers. The creature was never definitively identified. Some historians believe it was a large wolf or hybrid. Others have pointed to the wounds, which didn't match wolf behavior, and suggested something more disturbing. The attacks stopped only when a local hunter killed a large, unusual animal, and then they simply stopped. The Gévaudan case was so traumatic, it was absorbed into French cultural memory, and almost certainly reinforced the wolf in the woods as the ultimate symbol of female vulnerability in public space. But Little Red Riding Hood's darkest historical reading comes from the psychoanalytic tradition, and you don't have to be Freudian to see it. In the earliest oral versions of the story, before Perrault sanitized it, Red Riding Hood doesn't get rescued. She escapes on her own, using her own wit. She tells the wolf she needs to go relieve herself, ties herself to a rope, and runs. The wolf waits. She doesn't come back. The version where she needs saving, where she's passive, where she makes mistakes, where she requires a male authority figure to cut her out of the wolf's belly, is the version that was written down and disseminated. The original, competent, self-rescuing girl was edited out of her own story. That editing is its own horror story. And Rapunzel, the last one, connects to something so specific it almost defies belief. In 14th century Germany, a woman named Barbara Kramers was reportedly imprisoned in a tower by her father to keep her away from a man he disapproved of. Local records, fragmentary but consistent, describe a girl kept in a high room, her only contact with the outside world through a window. Whether hair was literally involved is probably apocryphal. What isn't apocryphal is the practice. Across medieval and early modern Europe, girls were routinely confined, in towers, in convents, in locked rooms and family estates, to preserve their marriageability, to punish disobedience, or to enforce the economic value of their virginity. The tower isn't a metaphor. The tower was infrastructure. Rapunzel, like all of these stories, isn't really about magic. The witch isn't supernatural evil. She's controlling authority wearing a woman's face. The tower isn't enchanted. It's a room with no stairs and a window you can't reach. And the prince doesn't really save her. In the Grimm version, he's blinded by the witch and wanders in the wilderness for years while Rapunzel survives on her own, raising their twins in the desert. She was never waiting to be saved. She was just waiting to be old enough to leave. That's what these stories are at their core. They're not about curses and spells and dark magic. They're about power. Who has it, who enforces it, and what happens to people who don't. The fairy tale ending exists because the real ending was too hard to say out loud. Someone had to give these women a way out that wasn't humiliation, death, or silence. So they gave them a prince. They gave them a kiss. They gave them an escape that the actual women in the actual towers and the actual locked rooms never got. The magic was always a mercy. The horror was always the truth.